The courtroom was quiet when my father said it, not angry, not emotional, just calm. He looked directly at the jury and told them that I had been stealing money from my dead mother for years. The room shifted slightly after that. You could feel people deciding who I was, a dishonest son, a parasite, a man who waited for his mother to die so he could take what was left. My father spoke slowly, confidently, like a man who believed the story would hold. What he did not know, what he could not possibly know, was that the judge listening to every word already knew the truth, and my father had just put it on record. Before any of this began, my life was quiet in a way that most people would probably overlook. Nothing dramatic, nothing impressive, just routines. Every morning I drove the same road to my mother's house. It was a narrow street lined with old trees that leaned slightly toward the pavement, like they had grown tired of standing upright after so many years. The houses there had not changed much since I was a child. Same porches, same faded mailboxes, same cracked sidewalks that lifted a little more each winter. My mother had lived in that house for almost 40 years. After she became ill, the house changed in small ways. Medical equipment appeared slowly. First a pill organizer, then a blood pressure monitor. Eventually a hospital bed that replaced the old one she used to sleep in. But the rhythm of the place stayed the same. I would arrive in the morning, let myself in with the spare key, and the kettle would already be on. My mother always woke up early, long before I got there. She said mornings were easier for her. Less pain. We rarely spoke about the illness directly. Instead, we talked about ordinary things. The neighbor's dog, a television program she watched the night before. Sometimes she would ask about my work, though she never seemed interested in the details. What mattered to her was that I sounded calm when I talked about it. Those mornings were quiet, comfortable in a way that did not require explanation. My father was different. He was not a cruel man, at least not in the obvious ways people usually imagine. He never shouted. He never broke things. He never raised his voice at my mother. But he believed in control. Control of schedules, control of finances, control of decisions. That had always been his role in the family. He handled the accounts, the insurance policies, the legal paperwork. When I was younger, I never questioned it. My mother trusted him with those things, and that seemed like enough. Even when she became sick, he remained the one who spoke to the insurance companies and the banks. At least in the beginning. Over time, though, he started coming to the house less often. He said it was work. He had always worked long hours, so the explanation sounded reasonable. When I visited my mother in the mornings, he had already left. When I stopped by again in the evenings, sometimes he had not returned yet. At first, none of it seemed unusual. Someone had to keep working. Medical care was expensive, and my father often reminded us of that fact. He spoke about bills the way some people talk about weather. Calmly, but with a sense that they were unavoidable forces. So I began helping where I could, picking up prescriptions, driving my mother to appointments, making sure the paperwork from the hospital stayed organized in the kitchen drawer where she liked to keep it. It was never a formal responsibility, just something that happened naturally. My mother would ask me to stop by the pharmacy on the way over. I would bring the receipt back and leave it on the counter. Sometimes she would hand it to my father later. Sometimes she would simply file it away. None of us talked about it very much. Trust has a quiet way of operating inside families. It exists in small assumptions. You assume the numbers on a bill are correct. You assume the signature on a document belongs to the person who signed it. You assume the people closest to you are acting in good faith. For most of my life, I believed those assumptions were safe. My father rarely discussed the details of the finances with either of us. When he did, it was usually brief. "Everything's handled," he would say. Or sometimes, The insurance covered most of it. My mother always nodded when he said those things. She trusted him, and because she trusted him, I did too. In the final year of her illness, the routines became even more consistent. Morning tea, medication schedules, quiet conversations about things that did not matter very much. There was comfort in that repetition. It gave the days structure when everything else felt uncertain. Occasionally, my father would appear at the house earlier than expected. When he did, he usually walked straight into the kitchen and began sorting through the stack of envelopes on the counter. Bank statements, insurance letters, medical invoices. He would flip through them methodically, separating some into a folder he carried with him. I assumed he was organizing things, handling the details the way he always had. Sometimes he would ask a simple question. "Did you pay this pharmacy bill already?" I would tell him no. I usually just picked up the medication and left the receipt. He would nod, make a note on the envelope, and place it inside his folder. Nothing about those moments seemed important at the time. They were small, routine, the quiet mechanics of a family dealing with illness. Looking back now, I understand something I did not see then. Trust does not usually disappear all at once. It erodes slowly. But in those days, sitting at the kitchen table with my mother while the kettle whistled softly on the stove, I still believed the structure around us was solid. Family, records, responsibility, systems, all of it felt stable. None of us were preparing for a courtroom, and I certainly never imagined that one day my father would stand in front of a jury and calmly explain why his own son had been stealing from a dying woman. At the time, the world still felt normal, quiet, ordered, trustworthy. I did not yet know that the records inside those kitchen folders were already beginning to tell a different story. The first signs that something was wrong did not feel like warnings. They felt like inconveniences, small interruptions in a routine that had been steady for years. At the time, nothing about them seemed large enough to question. My mother's illness had already turned the house into a place of constant adjustments. Schedules changed. Medication doses shifted. Doctors added new instructions almost every week. So when small irregularities appeared, I treated them the same way. Just another complication. One afternoon, I stopped by the pharmacy to pick up a refill for my mother's medication. It was something I had done dozens of times before. The pharmacist recognized me by then and usually had the prescription ready by the time I reached the counter. But that day, she hesitated. She studied the screen for longer than usual. Then she said quietly, "It looks like this was already picked up yesterday." I assumed it was a mistake. "That's not possible," I told her. "I was here 2 days ago for the last one." She checked again. The computer showed the medication had been collected the previous afternoon, signed for, paid. I stood there for a moment trying to understand it. My mother had not left the house in weeks. I had been at work all day the day before. The pharmacist asked if someone else might have collected it for her. I thought about that. My father occasionally handled things like that, but it was rare. He preferred dealing with insurance companies and paperwork, not pharmacies. Still, it seemed like the most reasonable explanation. "Maybe my father stopped by," I said. The pharmacist nodded and handed me a printed receipt showing the pickup time. It did not seem important enough to argue about. I drove to my mother's house and placed the receipt on the kitchen counter beside the others. Later that evening, my father arrived. I mentioned the pharmacy situation while he was sorting through the envelopes on the counter. "Did you pick up Mom's medication yesterday?" He did not look up right away. He finished reading the paper in his hand before answering. "Yes," he said. The answer was calm, immediate, but something about the timing of it felt slightly delayed, as if he had considered another response first. "Why?" he asked. "The pharmacist thought I already had it," I said. "I just wanted to make sure." My father slid the receipt into his folder without examining it. "I'm handling some of those things now," he said. "It's easier if fewer people are involved." There was nothing unreasonable about that statement. In fact, it sounded practical. Medical care had become complicated. Bills arrived constantly. Insurance forms were stacked on the kitchen table almost every week. If my father wanted to centralize things, that made sense. So I nodded and let the conversation end there. But over the next few weeks, similar moments began to appear. Sometimes I would open the kitchen drawer where my mother kept hospital paperwork and notice that certain envelopes were gone. Not all of them, just a few. Other times I would see my father standing at the counter late in the evening, carefully removing documents from the drawer and placing them into his briefcase. He worked slowly, methodically, like someone reviewing details that mattered. When I asked if he needed help organizing anything, he usually gave the same answer. "No, I've got it." My mother rarely commented on those moments. She was often tired in the evenings, and conversations about paperwork did not interest her much. But one afternoon she asked a question that stayed with me. We were sitting at the kitchen table after lunch when she looked toward the counter where the stack of envelopes usually sat. "Did your father move those statements?" she asked. I followed her gaze. The counter was unusually clear. The pile of bank letters and medical invoices that had been there that morning was gone. "I think he's organizing them," I said. She seemed to consider that. Then she nodded slowly. "That's probably good," she said. Her tone was neutral, but there was a small pause before she spoke again. "He's been very careful about the accounts lately." I did not know what she meant by that. Careful sounded responsible. Responsible sounded normal. Still, a few days later, another small moment happened. I ran into my aunt at a grocery store not far from my mother's neighborhood. She was pushing a cart slowly down the aisle when she saw me. Her smile looked polite but slightly restrained. We talked about my mother for a few minutes. She asked how the treatments were going and whether the doctors had changed anything recently. Then, as she reached for a box of tea, she said something that caught me off guard. "I heard you've been helping manage some of her finances." The statement sounded casual, but it was phrased like information she had already received from someone else. "I'm not managing anything," I said. "I just pick up prescriptions sometimes." She nodded again, though the expression on her face did not fully change. "Well," she said carefully, "it's good someone is keeping an eye on things." The conversation moved on after that, but the comment stayed with me longer than it should have. Not because it was accusatory, because it suggested a story I did not recognize. At the time, I told myself it was nothing. Families talk, details get mixed up. People misunderstand simple situations. Still, as I drove away from the grocery store that afternoon, I noticed something strange. For the first time since my mother became ill, the routines around her care felt slightly uncertain. Not broken, just misaligned. Like a set of records that no longer matched the events they were supposed to describe. I did not know it yet, but the first version of the story about me had already started moving through the family. Quietly, and I had not even heard it being told. After my mother died, the house became quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar. Not peaceful, just empty. For months, the place had been filled with the small sounds of illness, pill bottles opening, medical machines humming softly, the slow rhythm of my mother moving through the day. When those sounds stopped, the silence felt unnatural. My father stayed there alone. I visited less often at first. Partly because the house no longer required the same routines, and partly because grief creates a strange distance between people who do not know how to talk about it. When I did stop by, my father seemed focused on practical matters, closing accounts, contacting insurance companies, reviewing paperwork related to the estate. He spoke about these things calmly, almost mechanically, as if completing a checklist. "Your mother kept too many separate accounts," he told me one evening while sitting at the kitchen table. There were several folders spread out in front of him: bank statements, investment summaries, medical expense reports. "I'm consolidating everything," he said. That sounded reasonable. My mother had always handled small household accounts while my father managed the larger financial decisions. Over the years, those systems had multiplied. Different savings accounts, small investment funds, insurance reimbursements tied to medical care. It made sense that someone needed to organize them. I assumed my father was doing exactly that. But a few weeks later, I noticed something that did not fit the explanation. I had stopped by the house to collect a few personal items my mother had wanted me to keep. Old photographs mostly, along with a small box of letters she had saved from when I was younger. While I was looking through the living room cabinet, my father called from the kitchen. "Come here a minute." When I entered the room, he was holding a bank statement. His expression was neutral but focused. "Did you ever have access to your mother's secondary savings account?" he asked. I shook my head. "I didn't even know she had one." He studied the page again. "There are several withdrawals listed here from the past year," he said. I stepped closer and glanced at the statement. The numbers meant very little to me. They were modest amounts, spaced several weeks apart. "What kind of withdrawals?" I asked. "Transfers," he said. "Where to?" He tapped the paper lightly. "It says they were authorized through online access." The statement did not list a destination account, only confirmation numbers and timestamps. "I've never logged into any of her accounts," I said. My father did not accuse me directly. Not then. He simply nodded and placed the statement back into the folder. "I'm sure there's an explanation," he said. His tone sounded reasonable, measured. But the conversation ended quickly after that. A few days later, something else happened. I received a call from a cousin I had not spoken to in months. The conversation began politely enough: questions about work, about how I was handling things after my mother's death. Then the tone shifted slightly. "I heard your dad is sorting out some financial issues," he said. "What kind of issues?" I asked. There was a pause. "Just some confusion with the estate accounts," he said carefully. "Apparently there were some irregular transfers." The word irregular hung in the air for a moment. I did not know how to respond. "Who told you that?" I asked. "My mother mentioned it," he said. "I think she heard it from your dad." I ended the call a few minutes later, not abruptly, just quietly. But when I sat there afterward, something began forming in my mind that had not existed before. A pattern. Small moments that had seemed unrelated were beginning to align. The pharmacy receipt. The missing statements. My aunt's comment at the grocery store. Now this. I tried to dismiss the feeling. Families misinterpret things all the time, especially after a death. Information travels through conversations that change slightly each time they are repeated. Still, a week later I encountered something that was harder to explain. I had gone to the bank to close a small joint account my mother had opened years earlier to help me during college. The account had barely been used in over a decade. When I sat down with the bank representative, she pulled up the records and began reviewing them. Then she paused. "There were several login attempts connected to your mother's primary account last year," she said. I frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" "Nothing unusual by itself," she said, "but they came from two different devices." She rotated the computer screen slightly so I could see the log entries. The timestamps were scattered across several months. Most were labeled with one device ID. but a few showed another. "Is that a problem?" I asked. She hesitated. "Not necessarily," she said. "Sometimes family members share access." I nodded slowly. But as I looked at the screen, a quiet realization settled over me. The records were showing activity inside my mother's accounts, transfers, login attempts, multiple devices. And somewhere outside that room, people had already begun discussing those records as if they belonged to me. The story had not been told to me yet. But it was clearly being told about me. And for the first time, I started wondering when it had actually begun. The first time my father accused me directly, he did it quietly. There was no argument leading up to it, no raised voices, just a conversation at the kitchen table that changed direction without warning. It was late afternoon, several weeks after the bank visit. I had stopped by the house to return a box of old documents that belonged to my mother. Most of them were medical records I had taken home earlier while helping organize things. My father was already sitting at the table when I arrived. He had a legal pad in front of him. Several folders were stacked neatly beside it. When I entered the room, he gestured for me to sit. "I've been reviewing the account history," he said. His tone was calm, professional. The kind of voice someone uses when discussing practical matters with a colleague rather than a family member. I sat across from him. "What kind of history?" I asked. He slid one of the folders toward me and opened it. Inside were printed bank statements. Highlighted lines ran across certain entries, transfers, dates, authorization numbers. "These withdrawals happened over the last year," he said. "I'm trying to understand them." I studied the paper briefly, though the numbers meant little to me. "I told you before," I said. "I never logged into Mom's accounts." My father nodded slowly, but his expression did not change. "That's what concerns me," he replied. The sentence was delivered so calmly that it took a moment to understand what he meant. "What do you mean?" I asked. He leaned back slightly in his chair. "Well," he said, "someone clearly had access." I waited for him to continue. When he did, his words came carefully. "Your mother trusted you with a lot of things during her illness. That doesn't mean I had access to her accounts." "I didn't say you did," he replied. The distinction was subtle. But it left the accusation sitting quietly between us. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he tapped the highlighted lines on the page again. "These transfers were authorized online," he said. "That requires credentials." I felt a faint sense of frustration building, though I kept my voice steady. "Then whoever had the credentials made the transfers," I said. My father watched me closely. "You spent more time in this house than anyone else last year," he said. It was not a question, just a statement. "Yes," I replied. "You also handled many of her day-to-day needs." "That's true. And she trusted you." Again, the same careful phrasing. I recognized what he was doing then, not accusing, not exactly, just arranging the facts in a sequence that implied a conclusion. "I never touched her accounts," I said. My father nodded once more. But this time his expression carried something new, a kind of controlled disappointment. "You may not realize how this looks," he said. The sentence landed heavily, not because it was loud, because it reframed the entire conversation. Suddenly, I was not defending myself against a misunderstanding. I was defending myself against an appearance, an interpretation that already existed. "Who else have you talked to about this?" I asked. My father paused. "Some family members," he said, "and the estate attorney." The words settled slowly in my mind. Family members, the attorney. The story was no longer contained inside this room. "How did you explain it to them?" I asked. "I told them there were irregularities," he said. "That's the honest description." I looked down at the highlighted statements again. Small transfers spread across months. Amounts that seemed almost insignificant compared to the medical expenses my mother had faced. "You think I did this," I said quietly. My father folded his hands on the table. I think the records raise questions, he replied. The phrasing was careful, precise. He was never directly stating the accusation. He was allowing the documents to imply it. Then we should ask the bank to investigate, I said. For the first time, he seemed slightly uncomfortable. That may become necessary, he said, but these things can also be resolved privately. Privately. The word carried an unspoken meaning. Families handle their own problems. Families avoid public embarrassment. Families accept explanations that allow everyone to move forward. But the explanation he seemed to expect was one I could not give. I'm not taking responsibility for something I didn't do, I said. My father's expression hardened slightly. Not anger, more like disappointment. You're being defensive, he said. I'm being honest. He shook his head slowly. Sometimes people convince themselves of things, he said. The sentence was delivered with quiet certainty, like a psychological observation rather than an accusation. You think I convinced myself I didn't steal from my own mother? I asked. I think grief affects memory, he said. For several seconds the room was silent again. The kettle on the stove began to whistle faintly. Neither of us moved to turn it off. In that moment I realized something that had not been clear before. This conversation was not about discovering the truth. My father had already decided what the records meant. The documents in those folders were not questions. They were evidence. Evidence he had been quietly sharing with other people. Evidence that explained why my aunt had spoken carefully at the grocery store. Why my cousin had mentioned irregular transfers. The narrative had been built piece by piece, and I had been the last person to hear it. My father finally closed the folder. We'll let the attorney review everything, he said calmly. That's probably the best way to resolve it. Resolve. The word sounded procedural, neutral. But as I left the house that evening, I understood something with a clarity that had been missing before. The story about me was no longer informal. It was moving toward something official, something that would not be settled at a kitchen table. And somewhere inside those folders, the records were already being arranged to support it. The first piece of evidence that contradicted my father's story appeared almost by accident. It came from a place no one in my family had considered important. A hospital billing system. Several months after the accusations began circulating, the estate attorney requested documentation related to my mother's medical expenses. It was a standard part of settling the estate, verifying which treatments had been covered by insurance and which payments had come directly from her accounts. I agreed to help gather the records. Not because anyone asked me to defend myself, but because I had spent the most time coordinating her appointments during the last year of her illness. I knew which clinics she visited and which pharmacies filled her prescriptions. The hospital's administrative office kept digital logs for everything. Appointment check-ins, prescription pickups, insurance authorizations, even visitor access records. When I sat down with the billing coordinator, she pulled up the timeline of my mother's treatments on her screen. It stretched across almost 18 months, each visit marked with a precise timestamp. I watched the dates scroll past slowly. Chemotherapy consultations, follow-up exams, lab tests. The final months of her care were documented in quiet rows of data. It felt strange seeing that year reduced to numbers and time codes. But then something caught my attention. One of the dates looked familiar. Not because of the appointment itself, but because it matched a transfer date my father had highlighted in the bank statements. A withdrawal that had supposedly been authorized online. The billing coordinator noticed me studying the screen. "Is something wrong?" she asked. I hesitated before answering. "Could you show me the check and log for that day?" I said. She opened another window. The system displayed the record immediately. My mother had been admitted to the oncology department that morning for a treatment session that lasted several hours. Below the appointment entry was a secondary record, visitor access. My name appeared there. The timestamp showed that I had entered the hospital at 9:12 a.m. and I had not left until 3:47 p.m. I stared at the numbers quietly. The bank transfer my father had questioned was listed at 11:03 a.m., right in the middle of that hospital visit. The billing coordinator noticed the silence. "Do you need a copy of that log?" she asked. "Yes," I said. She printed the document and slid it across the desk. At the time, it did not feel like a revelation. It felt like a small correction, one transaction that clearly could not have been authorized by me. But as I continued reviewing the records, the pattern repeated itself. Another transfer date, another hospital visit, another timestamp placing me physically somewhere else when the transaction occurred. Sometimes I had been sitting beside my mother during treatment. Sometimes I had been signing paperwork at the pharmacy counter. Sometimes I had been at my workplace, where security logs recorded employee entry and exit times automatically. Each system recorded its own version of events, independently, without any awareness of the accusations forming around them. When I returned home that evening, I began comparing the timestamps carefully. Bank transfers, hospital visits, pharmacy receipts, workplace security logs. At first, the connections seemed coincidental, but after several hours of reviewing the records, the pattern became difficult to ignore. Many of the withdrawals my father had highlighted occurred during periods when I was physically documented somewhere else. Not all of them, but enough to raise a question that had not been asked yet. If I had not authorized those transactions, who had? A few days later, another unexpected piece of information arrived. The bank's compliance department contacted the estate attorney regarding the account history. Large estates often triggered routine reviews, especially when multiple transfers occurred near the end of someone's life. The compliance officer who examined the account logs noticed something that had not been discussed before. Each online transfer contained a device identifier, a digital fingerprint attached to the computer or phone used to access the account. According to the bank's records, most of the transactions had been authorized from a single device, but a smaller number came from a second one. The compliance officer requested clarification about who in the family had legitimate access. The attorney asked my father. My father told him only one person had regular access during my mother's illness: me. When the attorney relayed that statement back to the bank, the compliance officer responded with a simple observation. The device ID associated with the majority of transfers had been used to access several other accounts connected to my father's personal business records. The same identifier appeared across multiple financial systems. It was not a shared family computer. It was linked to a device that regularly logged into accounts belonging exclusively to my father. No accusation was made. Compliance officers do not speculate. They simply document patterns. Still, when the attorney called me to discuss the finding, his voice sounded slightly different than before, more cautious. "Systems tend to keep very detailed records," he said. I understood what he meant. Unlike family conversations, systems do not adjust their stories to protect anyone. They simply record what happens, quietly, patiently. And over time, those records begin to align in ways that human explanations cannot easily change. By the end of that week, several independent systems had started telling a version of events that did not match the story my father had been repeating. Hospital logs, security access records, bank device identifiers. None of them were trying to defend me. None of them even knew the accusations existed. But together they were forming something powerful. A timeline. One that suggested the person responsible for those transfers might not be the person standing accused of them. And somewhere beyond those records, the legal case my father had started was continuing to move forward, toward a courtroom where all of those systems would eventually speak for themselves. The lawsuit arrived on a Tuesday morning. It was delivered in a thick envelope that looked more formal than anything I had received before. The return address belonged to a law firm I recognized from earlier conversations with the estate attorney. Inside were several pages of legal language. Most of it was procedural, but the central claim was simple. My father was formally accusing me of financial exploitation connected to my mother's estate. The document stated that unauthorized transfers had been made from my mother's accounts during the final year of her life. And according to the complaint, those transfers had been made by me. I read the pages slowly, not because the language was difficult, but because the calm tone of the accusations felt surreal. The document described a version of my life that did not exist. It portrayed me as someone who had quietly taken advantage of a dying woman's trust, someone who had used access to her home and daily care to manipulate her finances. The phrasing was careful, professional, but the meaning was clear. My father believed this story strongly enough to present it in court, or at least strongly enough to ask a judge and jury to believe it. The attorney I hired to represent me was a quiet man who rarely spoke more than necessary. When we first met, he listened for almost an hour without interrupting while I explained the situation. The illness, the pharmacy visits, the conversations at the kitchen table. When I finished, he leaned back slightly and folded his hands. "Family cases like this can become emotional," he said. "That's why courts rely heavily on records." I handed him the documents I had collected, hospital logs, security records from my workplace, printed timelines of the bank transfers. He studied them carefully, not reacting, just observing. After several minutes, he nodded once. "These are useful," he said. He did not say they would solve the case, only that they were useful. Meanwhile, my father's legal team began building their narrative. The complaint was only the beginning. Over the following weeks, they filed additional statements describing the alleged pattern of misconduct. They pointed to the same details my father had mentioned months earlier: my frequent presence at the house, my role in helping with medical appointments, my access to documents and daily routines. Taken individually, those facts were ordinary, but when arranged in the structure of a legal accusation, they became something else: opportunity, access, motive. I noticed something else as the filings continued. My father's language never sounded emotional. There were no angry accusations in the documents, only measured descriptions, calm explanations of how the transfers might have occurred. It was the same tone he had used at the kitchen table: reasonable, composed, the tone of someone presenting facts rather than opinions. To an outside observer, it would have sounded convincing, because the accusations were not dramatic, they were methodical. Each filing added another small detail: a transfer date, an account number, a statement about how my mother trusted me with daily responsibilities. None of the documents addressed the evidence I had collected: hospital timestamps, device identifiers, security logs. Those records simply did not appear in my father's version of the story. It was as if they did not exist. Eventually, the case reached the stage where both sides were required to exchange evidence formally. My attorney submitted our documentation without commentary, just records, official logs from independent systems. the kind of information courts tend to take seriously because it is not created by either party involved in the dispute. Several weeks later, my father's attorney responded with additional statements, but still no explanation for the conflicting timelines. Instead, the argument shifted slightly. They suggested that unauthorized access could have occurred earlier in the day, or that the transfers might have been scheduled in advance. Possibilities, hypothetical scenarios, each one designed to preserve the central accusation. Through all of this, my father remained publicly confident. Family members who spoke to him described the same calm certainty I had seen months earlier. He believed the evidence would eventually prove his case, or perhaps he believed the story itself was strong enough to stand without explanation. Either way, the legal process continued moving forward. Depositions were scheduled. Financial experts reviewed the account history. The court requested additional documentation from the bank's compliance department. With each step, the volume of records increased. Bank authentication logs, device identifiers, internal security reviews. The systems that had quietly recorded every financial interaction during my mother's final year were now being examined by people whose job was to analyze patterns, not emotions, not family dynamics, patterns. By the time the trial date was set, thousands of lines of data had been added to the case file. Most of it would never be discussed aloud in court, but it existed, stored in official records, waiting for someone to compare timelines carefully enough to see what they revealed. Through all of it, I remained mostly silent, not because I had nothing to say, but because I had begun to understand something about how these situations unfold. Arguments between people can be dismissed. Emotions can be questioned. Memories can be challenged, but systems do not argue. They simply record. And eventually, those records begin to tell a story of their own. The trial would give everyone a chance to hear that story. My father believed it would confirm his accusations. The jury would hear his explanation first, his interpretation of the transfers, his version of what had happened inside that house during the final year of my mother's life. He did not yet realize something important. The systems that recorded those events were not on anyone's side. They were simply waiting to be read. And once they were presented in the right order, the calm certainty he carried into that courtroom would begin to disappear. But that realization had not arrived yet. At that point, the case was still escalating, still building, still moving toward a moment where my father would stand in front of a jury and calmly explain why his son had stolen from a dying woman. And he would do it with complete confidence, because he believed the records supported him. By the time the trial began, I had already learned something about silence. It has weight, not the kind that presses down on you all at once, but the kind that settles slowly across weeks and months until speaking feels unnecessary. Most of the arguments had already happened before we ever entered the courtroom. Lawyers had exchanged documents. Experts had reviewed the financial records. Statements had been written and rewritten until every sentence sounded deliberate. The courtroom itself felt quieter than I expected. Not dramatic, just formal. The kind of place where people lower their voices automatically, even when no one tells them to. My father sat at the table across from mine. He looked composed, not tense, not angry, just certain. For most of my life, I had seen that same expression whenever he discussed financial decisions. He believed strongly in preparation, and preparation usually produced confidence. The trial began with procedural steps that felt distant from the accusations themselves. Jury selection, opening instructions from the judge, explanations about how evidence would be presented. Then my father's attorney stood and delivered the opening statement. It was carefully structured, not emotional. The attorney spoke about trust inside families, about how illness often creates opportunities for quiet financial misconduct. He described the final year of my mother's life as a period when she had relied heavily on me, driving her to appointments, handling prescriptions, managing daily needs. Each statement was true, but arranged together they created a picture that felt unfamiliar. The attorney then introduced the bank transfers, a series of withdrawals from accounts belonging to my mother, small amounts, spread across several months, each one authorized through online access. During this time, the attorney said calmly, the defendant had regular access to the home, the computer systems, and the financial documents belonging to the deceased. The words echoed softly across the room. No accusations shouted, just facts placed in sequence, opportunity, access, timing. I watched several members of the jury take notes. From their perspective, the story probably sounded logical. My father testified later that afternoon. He spoke the same way he always had, slowly, confidently, never raising his voice. When the attorney asked him about the transfers, he explained how he first noticed them while reviewing account statements after my mother's death. He described the confusion he felt, the disappointment. Then he said something that made several jurors glance toward me. I trusted my son completely, he said, but the records forced me to confront something I didn't want to believe. The sentence sounded heavy, measured, as if he had spent a long time arriving at that conclusion. He did not look at me while he said it. Instead, he looked toward the jury, calm, certain. When his testimony ended, the courtroom was silent for a few seconds. Then the judge turned to my attorney. Your witness. My attorney stood slowly. He walked to the center of the room with a folder in his hand. His approach was different, short questions, precise. He began by confirming basic details, dates, account numbers, the timeline of my mother's treatments. Then he introduced the hospital records. My father acknowledged that I had accompanied my mother to many appointments. That was never disputed. The attorney then asked about a specific date, one of the transfer dates highlighted in the complaint. Are you aware that the defendant was present in the oncology department for 6 hours that day? He asked. My father hesitated slightly. I'm aware he attended many appointments, he said. The attorney handed a printed log to the court clerk. The document showed the hospital entry and exit times. The timestamp of the bank transfer sat directly in the middle of that window. The attorney did not comment on it. He simply moved to the next document, another transfer date, another hospital visit, another system-generated record placing me somewhere else. The pattern appeared quietly, without explanation. My father shifted slightly in his chair, not dramatically, just enough to notice. Then the attorney introduced the device identification logs from the bank's compliance review. These records indicate the primary device used to authorize the transfers, he said. My father nodded cautiously. Yes. Is this device associated with the defendant? I don't know. The attorney paused. Then he presented another set of authentication records, this time connected to business accounts belonging to my father. The same device identifier appeared repeatedly, used to access his own financial systems. The courtroom remained quiet. No one spoke for several seconds. The attorney returned to his table. The judge looked down at the documents carefully. My father did not say anything. And in that moment, I felt something shift inside me. Not relief, not victory, something heavier. Because watching those records appear one after another made something clear that had taken months to understand. My father had built an entire case around a story he believed would never be tested this carefully. Maybe he had convinced himself the transfers would never be traced through independent systems. Maybe he believed the narrative alone would be enough. Either way, the truth was no longer hidden inside private conversations. It was sitting on the court record now, quiet, precise, and impossible to argue with emotionally. I was eventually called to testify. My attorney asked only a few questions, mostly about the routines I had with my mother during her illness, the pharmacy visits, the hospital appointments. When the questioning ended, the judge asked if I wished to add anything further. I looked around the courtroom briefly, at the jury, at the folders filled with records, then at my father. He still had not looked directly at me since the testimony began. "I have nothing to add," I said. The words felt small, but they were enough, because the systems had already spoken. And nothing I said would change what they had recorded. By the time the final stage of the trial began, the tone in the courtroom had changed. Not dramatically. No one announced it, but the quiet certainty that had surrounded my father's accusations earlier in the week had started to fade. It happened gradually. Each new document added a small shift to the atmosphere in the room. A hospital log that placed me somewhere else. A device identifier linked to another account. Security records showing where I had been when certain transfers occurred. None of these things accused anyone directly. They simply removed possibilities. And as those possibilities disappeared, the story my father had presented became harder to maintain. The attorneys stopped speaking about opportunity. They stopped repeating the phrase access. Instead, the discussion turned toward systems. Authentication logs, device fingerprints, timestamp verification. The kind of information that does not respond to persuasion. During the final day of testimony, a representative from the bank's compliance department appeared in court. He was not connected to either side, just a man whose job involved reviewing irregular financial patterns. He explained how banks track device identifiers when accounts are accessed online. Each computer or phone leaves a unique signature when it connects. Those signatures remain attached to the account history. The compliance officer displayed a chart for the court, a timeline of the transfers. Beside each transaction was the device identifier used to authorize it. Most of the entries carried the same signature, the one that had appeared earlier in the trial. The identifier linked to the device used to access my father's business accounts. The officer did not speculate. He simply confirmed the records. This identifier appears consistently across multiple financial platforms connected to Mr. Carter's accounts, he said. My father's attorney asked several questions, possibilities, hypothetical scenarios. Could someone else have used the device? Could credentials have been shared? The compliance officer answered calmly. Those situations are technically possible, he said, but they are not indicated by the records we have reviewed. Then he stepped down from the stand. The courtroom remained quiet again. The evidence had never pointed a finger directly at my father. That was not how systems work. But the structure of the accusation had collapsed, not loudly, just steadily. During closing arguments, my father's attorney spoke briefly. The confident narrative from earlier in the trial was gone. Instead, he suggested that the financial activity might simply remain unexplained. A complicated situation during a stressful time. My attorney responded in the same quiet tone he had used throughout the case. He did not accuse my father of anything. He simply reminded the jury of the records they had seen, hospital logs, device identifiers, independent systems that had documented events long before the lawsuit began. These records were not created for this courtroom, he said. They were created as part of ordinary operations by institutions with no interest in this dispute. Then he sat down. The jury left the room to deliberate. It did not take long. When they returned, the foreperson stood and read the verdict. The claim of financial exploitation was rejected. There was no legal basis to hold me responsible for the transfers. The judge thanked the jury for their service and began the procedural steps required to close the case. No one spoke loudly. No one reacted dramatically. My father remained seated while the paperwork was finalized. For the first time since the trial began, he looked in my direction. Not for long. Just a brief glance across the room. His expression was difficult to read. Not anger, not regret, something quieter, maybe calculation, maybe realization. The systems that had quietly recorded every transaction during my mother's final year had done something neither of us expected. They had preserved the truth without needing anyone to defend it. Outside the courtroom, people began leaving quickly. Jurors returned to their lives. Attorneys gathered their files. The bank representative disappeared into the hallway without speaking to anyone. Within minutes, the room was almost empty. My attorney shook my hand once. "Records tend to be reliable witnesses," he said. Then he left. My father remained near the doorway for a moment longer, but he did not approach me. He walked out of the building without speaking. And just like that, the case was finished. The accusations that had traveled through family conversations and legal filings for months had ended with a single quiet decision. Not dramatic, not public, just a correction entered into the official record. The systems had spoken, and the story my father had built around those transfers could no longer survive inside the same timeline. The courthouse was almost empty by the time I walked outside. Late afternoon light had settled across the steps, the kind that makes everything look slightly faded. People were already leaving the parking lot in small groups, jurors, attorneys, clerks returning to their ordinary routines. The case had taken months to build. It ended in less than an hour. No reporters waited outside. No one asked questions. The decision had simply been recorded, the way thousands of other legal decisions are recorded every year. A correction placed quietly into the system. My father stood near the far edge of the parking area. For a moment, I thought he might come over. But he didn't. He spoke briefly with his attorney, nodded once, and then walked toward his car. The distance between us remained exactly the same, not widened, not closed, just fixed. I realized then that the trial had only resolved one thing: the records. That was all the court could restore. It could not repair the conversations that had already happened inside the family. The quiet suspicions. The careful way relatives had started speaking to me months earlier. Those things existed outside the courtroom. They would continue existing long after the case file was closed. I stood on the steps for a few minutes watching the traffic move along the street. My mother used to say that systems, banks, hospitals, courts were designed to outlast the people who used them. At the time, it sounded like a practical observation. Now it felt heavier, because she had been right. Those systems had preserved the truth about what happened during her final year, not through emotion. Not through arguments, just through records. The judge closed the case with a short statement that afternoon. Procedural, formal. The file would remain part of the court archive, accessible if anyone ever wanted to read it carefully. I don't know if anyone in my family ever will, but the record exists now. Quiet, permanent. And somewhere inside that archive is the moment my father stood in a courtroom and told a jury I had stolen from my dying mother, along with the systems that proved he was wrong.